Hello, my name is Ben Davis, and I am here to talk to you about a community archiving workshop series that I'm conducting in conjunction with Dr. Roberts and the Texas Freedom Colonies Project. I run a company called Brazos Archival, and we focus on digitizing, providing access, and preserving archival materials for small museums and personal archives. This will be a three-part workshop series covering arrangement and description, preservation, and digital archives. And so, according to the Society of American Archivists, community archives are defined as the documentation of a group of people that share common interests and social, cultural, and historical heritage, usually created by members of the group, being documented and maintained outside of traditional archives. So, when communities are able to advocate for themselves, then we may actually be contributing to a more accurate and inclusive history. And so the goal of these workshops are to empower you to document yourself. So workshop number one will address arrangement and description. And you can think of arrangement as the organization and sequencing of physical items, and description you can think of as creating a set of data to describe those physical items. So the act of archiving is as much about being talented at or being good at getting rid of things as determining what to save. So with regard to that, the Society of American Archivists defines archives as records created or received by a person, family, or organization and preserved because of their continuing value. So continuing value is what we want to focus on in this stage, and defining continuing value. So on the left, you'll see some criteria for defining continuing value. Those criteria are financial, can be legal, sentimental, evidential, and if you're an organization, you might want to define organizational policies. Typically, financial criteria are not high on the agenda of an archive, as it doesn't provide a lot of meaning, but you may very well come across financially valuable objects in your archive, jewelry or rare books, for instance. Legal criteria for value are important. Hopefully that's high on your priority list. That could include birth certificates, passports, information with social security numbers, articles of establishment for a business. Sentimental value can also be important. You may come across a wooden cooking spoon that reminds you of times you spent in the kitchen cooking with your grandmother, or an old wrench even that you used to help your grandfather fix things in the garage. It's difficult to say what will have meaning in that way, but those objects can be embedded with those memories, so you'll want to keep them. And they may have stories attached to them as well. Value can also be evidential, like proof that an event happened, for instance, with letters, maybe letters written by a relative from overseas during a war. You may come across a bill of sale for an object or even a property, and this you may also come across receipts that would document the evidence of success of a business. If you are an organization, it's probably a good idea to define organizational policies with regard to collecting and defining that value. So, for instance, you may want to define your collection based on regional boundaries or a cultural movement. You want to define your space and let others specialize in their areas. Don't try not to overlap with other organizations collecting in other areas. And if you're migrating to an institution and from your personal archive, like you're donating to an archive, it's important that you know what policies those organizations collect around. And as you're defining continuing value, you want to document your process. So, for instance, you never know what's going to be sentimental to other people. And down the road, you may have a relative that may come to you and say, "Why did you get rid of this thing?" And you'll be able to kind of explain that and account for your process if you document that. Um, also, if you are an organization, you'll want to define parameters for care to make sure that it's clear what level of care you're able to provide. You may have only enough resources to provide a certain level of care. And also, if you're donating your personal archive to an organization, it's helpful to understand what the limits of that care are. Um, and for instance, that can take the form of digital access and whether or not that will be made available and who gets to keep original artifacts. And so, to save or not to save, that is the question. So, typically, items worth saving kind of fall into the criteria on the left here. So, if something tells a story, that's really important. That's the rich fabric that fills in the broader level research of county level records like census, tax roll, probate, court minutes, deed records. So the stories that fill in those narratives and help provide a human history and a personal history to that research is so important. So anything like letters or anything documenting a personal history. Also, you may come across things that are visually interesting, photographs that may remind you of a place or document a place, or annotations in books can be interesting. Also, rare or unusual artifacts. If you come across a group of items with a lot of items in them, you'll want to pick out the outliers and the really important pieces. Like, for instance, one journal entry out of many may document an important event, but the rest of the journal entries are just about going to the grocery store that day. For instance, I inherited a massive set of teacups with flowers painted on them because my great grandmother was an art teacher in Jasper, Texas, and for decades she painted flowers on teacups, and now I have to decide what to do with them, and I'm just going to keep the best ones probably. As we talked about, some things are evidentiary, and you may be able to prove the success of a business with evidentiary records. And legal and financial obligation, you may have tax records that are still within the time limit that you need to keep. With regard to quality of condition, some things just may be too far gone to keep, and we'll talk more about that later, but it's important to make that call because damaged materials can affect other things around them, like with mold or deterioration. So items that you don't want to keep, if you're looking at photographs that you don't know anybody in the photographs and you don't understand what they were made for, you may not need to hang on to that. Receipts are kind of a typical thing you don't want to hang on to. It's just not providing any context. Also, if the value is just not evident there, like if you come across an old sock in a drawer, that's probably not going to retain any value. If an item is in poor condition because of mold, it's a really serious issue because mold can transfer to other items. And if you come across duplicates, just pick one or two and hang on to those, but you don't need to keep everything. Like, for instance, if you come across neat letterhead or something, you may keep one or two of those. And if you know something is just not going to be used, you don't know why the owner kept it, then you can probably move on from that. So here's a receipt from an evidentiary receipt from Lee Harvey Oswald. If you come across one of those in your drawer, you probably want to hang on to that. But your personal receipts from going to the grocery store that are stuck in your junk drawer, that's probably not worth saving. So lasting impacts, can actually be unethical to exclude things from an archive. We all have family members who may have a conflicted or controversial history, but it's important that we document everything, and there are ways to approach that are ethical. If you have a family member that's still living and they could be embarrassed by this, then you may delay access and state that in the agreement between you and the institution you're donating to. You could use a pseudonym for that person. And with regard to privacy, anything with personal credentials probably doesn't need to be kept. Resumes, anything that provides height or weight information or social security numbers, student information, and legal considerations. If you're reporting to a legal body, it's important to know what record types you need to hang on to, for instance, an estate or tax records or anything like that, if there's a lawsuit pending. And it's also important to know the time that you need to keep those, or if there is a statute of limitations for that. Physical materials, no matter what, everything begins with a pile of unorganized, chaotic mess, and mess is a part of this process. It's very normal, so you just kind of embrace it. But the very first step in the entire process is designating a space or a staging area, and I like to designate a second area as well if you have the space, is an output area. So you have an area that you're working on, that you're organizing things in initially, and then once you've categorized and organized and digitized things, you have another area for that, so you know those items are finished. And even within that, if you're working with lots of people, for instance, it can be helpful to designate piles devoted to particular people, like a volunteer, so you don't overlap on somebody's work. Initially, though, you want to start broad and then refine. Don't try to get too detailed. You will get decision fatigue, and that will set in. And it's best just to be intuitive about the initial process. So make piles, broad categories, and use temporary labels, like even a sheet of notebook paper on the floor. And it's important that this is all temporary at this stage, because you're going to have to move that. And just be intuitive about it. There's a concept in archiving known as MPLP, which is more product, less process. So, being really nitpicky and detailed about things leaves lots of stuff inaccessible that nobody gets to see. So groups, batches, piles, and clusters. You want to group like material types, and perhaps by owner or subject, like Uncle Henry's photos and Aunt Gertrude's photos might be separate piles. And those piles may be according to provenance, like who the owner or maker of those objects were. And original order, if one can be discerned, you want to keep that. But if, for instance, you get something in a big trash bag and you have to dump it out anyway just to see it, you can probably assume there was no original order there, and you will need to make up your own order. So one really famous example of that was Francis Bacon's art studio, which was cataloged and archived and moved exactly as it was to a gallery in Ireland. And this was because he considered it his idea machine and crucial for generating ideas. So with regard to providing access, you'll need to start with an inventory of these piles that you just created. And spreadsheets are preferable because they're the first building block in a database. And a Word file is fine if that's what you're comfortable with, but ultimately it's going to need to get transferred to a spreadsheet eventually. And a spreadsheet will allow you to sort and filter information, and it's just conducive to this process. Typically the way that spreadsheets work when you're setting one up is rows are records and columns are fields. And if you need a template for that, don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'm happy to email you a template with fields already built into them. And so you also want to define who's going to use your collection. Is digitization going to be an option? And should the original materials be made available? And also, who is going to be the audience? Do you even want to make these items public? And you want to work that out in the agreement. Also, you want to create a guide to how the collection should be used. If you can label photos or provide any context possible, it's really important. This may be your last chance to let the world know what they're looking at. So workshop number 2 will focus on preservation, which is really the act of limiting damage. A lot of times people think of conservation and preservation as the same thing, but conservation is really its own field that has to do with repairing objects. It's kind of beyond the scope of this workshop, but preservation, as defined by the Society of American Archivists, is the professional discipline of protecting materials by minimizing chemical and physical deterioration and damage to minimize the loss of information and to extend the life of cultural property. So extending that life is really what we're talking about here, mitigating damage. So basic principles of preservation: leave no trace. I kind of borrowed that from the outdoors mantra and hiking. You just want to make it seem like you were never even there. Handle with care. Use both hands usually when you're dealing with archival materials or big flat boxes. They tend to bow in the middle. Keep objects dry. Store in a cool, dark place. Eliminate pests and pollution, and use archival materials. And that's really important. And I'll provide a list at the end for you of archival resources. So leave no trace. Use pencils always when you're working with archives. I think they make archival pens, but pencils are really kind of best practice. And no permanent highlighters or markers either. Adhesives really are problematic also. Scotch tape dries to things. Post-it notes don't age well either. And they do make archival glues, but it's best if you can just not use adhesives. And fasteners are also problematic, like just in general, metals rust and cut. So no paper clips or 3-ring binders. If they aren't stored in the right climate, they will rust and they will tear things. Rubber bands will dry out and adhere to things. And with regard to handling with care, just always washing your hands is a great idea. Nitrile gloves are best practice. Typically people think that cotton gloves are good, but they tend to shed and you can't feel things through the gloves as easily, and they retain oil, and there's a temptation to reuse them. So nitrile gloves are really the best thing to use. Keep a clean workspace. Anything that you're not using while you're dealing with archival materials could potentially get in the way. No food or drinks. Food and drinks attract pests and can potentially get on objects that you're dealing with. And always place items flat. Don't let them hang off the table, and always use both hands. If you try to take a piece of paper across the room with one hand, it's just law of nature that will crease or fold. Also, boxes that are big that you deal with archives are they tend to bow in the middle. And so always maintain a dry environment for archival items. Don't store things in HVAC closets or bathrooms or near water pipes. They will, of course, damage the uh, physical integrity of things, but water also stains and it washes out inks and pigments, like can wash text out of paper, and creates mold, which mold is a really big issue. It contaminates and transfers to other items and it grows. So strategies to avoid this: uh, if you can help it, don't store anything near water pipes, and store things off the ground with shelving. I have some recommendations for archival shelving and the resources. And also, if you have the capacity for it, store things at a relative humidity if you have a really good air conditioning system. And cool, dark storage is also crucial. Light can accelerate decay. UV is also very harmful. Fading and sunburn can occur. So, um, and below you see that in the text on the left there that sun has kind of washed that away. So always store things indoors, away from light, and keep the room temperature close to 70 degrees if you can. And eliminate pests and pollution. So pests will eat archives, and unfortunately, that ties back into the food issue. Keep food and drinks away, and also um, don't store things in places that are prone to chemicals and odors, like where pets live, or in the garage where gas is kept, or there's smoke or exhaust. Pollution also accelerates decay. And strategies for mitigating pollution risk: just keep things. The garage is not a great place to keep things. It's not climate controlled, and there's like a lot of chemicals in the garage usually. And so, with regard to actually housing things and storing them in archival materials, um, lots of times people want to use Tupperware containers, and the plastic can actually trap humidity. So Rubbermaid containers are not the best idea always. The boxes, it's good if the box is breathable, and the moisture inside, if moisture gets trapped inside a box, that will accelerate decay. Um, if you're reusing boxes, you want to make sure that you clean them out so that there are no chemicals or odors left in them, or no residue from them. And don't overstack boxes, as they tend to crush. And if you're using non-archival materials, you will get acid burn, which is a yellowing of paper and objects because of the acidity of the materials. So you want to use acid-free materials from archival sources. Also, storing things in wooden drawers is not a good idea. Wood off gases and will damage other materials over time. So again, at the end, I have a list of resources for archival boxes and shelving for you to look at. With regard to photographs, you want to make sure that you use PAT tested plastic sleeves, and that stands for the photographic activity test. And also, you don't want to put loose objects in boxes, as when you stack them, the box may crush or the object may bounce around in there and get damaged. So If you have to use an oversized box, you want to support the material inside the box with something like foam or just limit the space inside the box for the object to bounce around in. And with regard to damaged materials, it's kind of beyond the scope of this workshop. It ties into conservation, but there are things that you can do to repair some of the common issues like brittle newspapers and stuck together photographs. Brittle newspapers are probably best digitized. Stuck together photos can be separated with a clean water bath. Damaged hard drives, for instance, can be repaired, and data can be harvested. If the ports are damaged, they can be resoldered. But it's kind of beyond the scope of what we can talk about here. And workshop number 3 deals with digital archives, so digitizing items and preserving them in a digital environment. So according to the Society for American Archivists, digital preservation is the management and protection of digital information to ensure authenticity, integrity, reliability, and long-term accessibility. So initially, when you get to this stage, if this is an option for you or you are going to go forward with a digitization project, you will need to reorganize the materials that you originally organized into subject piles. So now you'll need to reorganize things based on format for your scanning station, especially if you have only one scanning station. If you have to change formats, you'll have to recalibrate the machine every time you do that, and that will really bog you down. So now that you've made an inventory of your objects and you have that in a spreadsheet form, hopefully, you can reorganize your objects according to format for the scanning station. And when you're finished scanning, you can put them back into their original subject categories, hopefully in archival boxes. And a lot of times you'll come across annotations like you see on the right, and it's really great if you can include that in the metadata of the file. So Lightroom, Adobe Lightroom is a software, this catalog software that you use for scanning. In that software, there's a metadata panel with notes. You can type in that information. And if there's any original labels, you want to type that information in as well. And so with regard to the actual digitization, the federal agency's Digitization Guidelines Initiative is sort of the gold standard for digitizing objects. It's a very technical document, and I would recommend looking at Peter Crow's book, Digitizing Your Photos First. It's really a condensed, user-friendly version of the FADGI document, and I have included that in the resource list as well as equipment recommendations. But camera scanning has become the way forward in this realm. It is the fastest method for scanning objects. It is the most versatile method for scanning objects. And it's the most sustainable method for scanning objects. So you can reconfigure that in many different ways, that setup in many different ways to scan many different objects. And because of that, it will last longer than a typical flatbed scanner. And so I can show you the process of setting up one digitization session for one format of material. So I have a framed object, and I'm going to do many of them. So I'll place the lights at 45 degrees, photograph a color chart, and then take an initial capture. And you can see that there's some issues, so I have to use a bounce card to separate the drawing from the frame. And already I take another picture, and already that looks a lot better. And so when you export files, TIFF files are considered the most archival file format. You always want to use uncompressed file formats. Another archival format is the DNG, or digital negative. JPEG files are very common, but that's typically what you use for sharing. JPEG files will degrade over time, and JPEG files are what you want to create from your TIFF files, but you don't want the JPEG files to be your archival file format. You want TIFF files to put in cold storage for digital preservation. And so the camera scanning unit itself, you can plan to spend between $3,000 and possibly $6,000 on this unit. I have different configurations in the resource list, and I'm happy to recommend equipment for you and spec equipment for you. It's a good idea to get an idea of the size range of your archive before you purchase anything, and so that you can make sure that your equipment can cover your material. So as far as copy stands, the Kaiser RS1 and the Bessler CS are kind of high-end institutional type stands. And the main thing with a camera stand is you just want to make sure that the base of it will accommodate the material that you're trying to scan. And there are other considerations too, like if you have large maps or drawings where the paper wants to curl, you'll probably want a metal base on your stand so that you can magnetize objects to that to keep them flat while you're scanning them. And if you have transparency materials like negatives, you'll want to get a light table to put on top of that. And you just want to make sure that it's big enough that it can cover everything as well. With regard to cameras, the 20 megapixels is kind of the minimum resolution you want to go with. If you already own a camera, you'll probably want to stay in that system and purchase lenses within that system and all the accessories within that system. But here are two of the kind of top tier cameras in DSLRs, the Nikon D850 and the Canon 5DSR. And with lenses, macro lenses are really best. If you're scanning something larger though, like a map or a painting, you'll want a 90 millimeter flat field lens. And the rule there is you want to use the longest lens you can get away with. And with regard to lights, I came across these Neewer LED lights. So if you don't already have lights, it's a good idea to look at LED lights. And the main consideration there is the CRI, or color rendering index. And this is really relates to how accurately the lights can reproduce color. If you're scanning black and white images, it's really not an issue. But if you're scanning color negatives, this is where that issue crops up most. And really, LED lights are affordable now. Also, LED lights don't emit a lot of heat, which can affect objects. It can cause paper to curl. And so film scanning is really fastest and best with a camera scanning solution now. I've run lots of tests on this, and I can scan 10 negatives to every 1 negative I can scan on a flatbed scanner. And I tested this while scanning a 26,000 image archive, and I would never have been able to complete that with a flatbed scanner alone. So it's the resolution is there with 50 megapixel backs, DSLR cameras, and all you need is a rail system like this, which can be purchased from a company called Really Right Stuff. And don't hesitate to let me know how to configure, if you need help configuring that. And then you'll just need a light source on the other side of your negative carrier to illuminate the negative. Flatbed scanners are really great. You can scan transparencies and documents and prints. The Epson V-Series scanners are really high quality. They're a really high resolution scanner, and they're cost effective at $1,149. But as I mentioned, they're really slow, and you're limited to the size of the scanning bed. So anything over 8 by 10 inches, you can't scan. Duplex scanners are really great for their purpose. If you have lots of unbound 8x10 documents, they're excellent. You can scan them really fast, and they scan both sides, and they OCR the material when you digitize them, which means you can read the text in the computer. It will pick it out, and you can search it. It stands for optical character recognition. And they are high resolution, but you can only do unbound documents in a duplex scanner. You really can't put thick prints through it or anything else. And the duplex scanners run around $500. And with regard to film, video, and audio preservation, your main file format should be either a WAV, MOV, or AVI. MP3s and MP4s are good for sharing and streaming, but not for archiving. And you always want to keep your originals, because in this environment you may find yourself referring back to the original to scan it for a new format or platform, and it's always important. You may find yourself having to revisit the original. And some of the issues that can crop up in a digital archive are bit rot, digital media obsolescence, physical media decay, file format obsolescence, and link rot. Bit rot is what happens when you open and save a JPEG lots and lots of times. Over time, the algorithm continues to compress the data in the file, and it becomes pixelated like the image you see on the right. Storage media obsolescence, we don't use floppy disks anymore, or zip disks, and physical media decay. If you haven't had a hard drive fail on you, it will happen. It's just a matter of time. So you want to make sure you have multiple copies in different places. Hard drives are made up of moving parts, so they will fail. And file format obsolescence. You can create a file format that can't be read in newer software, and you'll have to update those files. And link rot, again, you can create links to things that where the websites die, so it's important to harvest any information that you are linking off to if you can, like save a PDF of the web page. And so strategies with regard to digital preservation, it's just a reality that we're only ever waiting for the next platform to transition to. And so redundancy is crucial. You want to create lots of copies and keep those copies in different places. And file format migration and social media. Social media is an option. It's just an imperfect one. So redundancy, again, refers to lots of copies and copies in more than one place. Some options for that can be cloud storage, like Google Drive or Microsoft's OneDrive or Amazon S3 or Apple's Cloud or Google Cloud Platform. And you can also use removable media like hard drives and flash drives. And it's good to have both. Honestly, it's good to have a cloud solution and a hard drive solution. So the configuration on the right is really kind of a minimum that you'll want to consider. So you have your laptop or your computer, you have some files on there, and then you have an external drive backed up to where the files on your computer back up, and then the third solution could be a cloud account, for instance, like Google Drive, or a third hard drive. And file format migration, it's important to update constantly. And if you're updating two individual hard drives or optical media that have a size limit, it can be really helpful to size folders in your computer that are the same size as the media. So you know that one folder on your computer equals one folder backup on this disk or this hard drive that you're backing up to. And so if you're going through your digital archive and you come across any Kodak photo CDs or Kodak RAW files or PICT files, those formats are definitely in danger and you want to update them. And one good way to do that is through the Adobe DNG Digital Negative Converter. It's free, and I'll provide a link to that in the resources. And again, social media you can think of as an imperfect solution. It's there are a lot of issues with it, but there's a lot of positive things to think about as well. So social media is great for access and sharing. It's great for creating keywords and categories and captions, depending on what service you use. And you can reuse content ad infinitum. You can interact with people and get feedback, and relatives can chime in. But the drawbacks can be restrictive terms of service based on the company that you're using, and you really don't have any control over how they can use your content. You're storing content on their servers, and they may use proprietary file formats that you can't use or something like that. And also, when you upload things to social media, it crunches down your files and compresses them even more, and so it degrades the file quality. So you don't want to look at that as a long-term solution. You want to keep an archive away from there and on your hard drive or computer. So also, once you decide to make things accessible via social media, it's hard to wipe that away from the internet. You can't really keep people from downloading your images and using them. And you're also tied to an account when you use social media. So, one other thing to mention was that PhotoShelter and SmugMug are probably the better social media platforms to use for archiving. Both of them provide full TIFF backups. Only SmugMug does not provide a DNG backup, but PhotoShelter will. So putting it all together, step one is arranging and describing your assets, and so you'll be kind of describing and arranging at the same time, creating temporary labels. And if you're going to digitize, the next step in the process would be to arrange items by format. And while you're doing that, you can be working on your spreadsheet database and inventory, and then you will begin the digitization process and harvest any material, any annotations or labels, and put them in the metadata and save files as TIFF files. And then you will, on the other end of that, store things in their final home. So for digital files, that'll be cold storage in a hard drive or a cloud account. And if it's a physical item, in an archival box in a cool, dry place. And at the very end of that process, if you decide you want things to be accessible to the public, you'll have an agreement and an archive guide drawn up already, and you can decide which institution you may want to donate to, or if you want to provide electronic access, or if you want to create a website for your archive. And that kind of completes the process. So here are some resources. I have a PDF that I would be happy to email to you, and just let me know, email me if I can provide any information for you, templates for speccing equipment, or templates for creating a database, or just consultation. I look forward to working with everybody in this series of workshops.